Hi, we're about to start the final section of the biological perspective on personality, and so we're going to finish out with two more things. Whoopi Goldberg! Where are your eyebrows? It's so weird. No, I can't handle it. Go away. No, you don't have eyebrows. Okay, I don't like it. I mean, I love Whoopi Goldberg. Like, she's a fantastic person as far as I can tell, and she's a good actress, but eyebrows. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you for our last little lecture here on the biological approach. Okay, so we're almost done with this perspective. We're going to talk about these last two bullet points today for this mini lecture, twin studies and how we use those in the biological approach to personality, and then neuroscience research. Okay, so let's start with twin studies. So the biological approach says that things like our genetics affect our personality. If that is true, we could learn a lot about how influential genetics are by doing twin studies. Twin studies are used in psychology a lot to look at the influence of things like genetics by comparing different kinds of twins in different situations. So, monozygotic twins have the exact same genetics as each other. This is what we would also call identical twins. They have 100% of the same genetics as each other. So if personality is biologically driven, the personality of identical twins should be super similar. We can compare their levels of similarity to other types of siblings. So dizygotic twins were from two different eggs. And the idea is that they should have moderate levels of correlation with each other because they have some genetics that are the same because they have the same parents probably, but they're just like any other siblings. So we can compare the identical twins to fraternal twins or to any other siblings who are not twins. The dizygotic twins might be a little bit more similar to each other than non-twin siblings because they're the same age. So they've gone through the same cultural events and the same grades in school and stuff like that. We can also compare all three of those sets of siblings to adopted siblings who have the same environment but very different genetics. And we can also do twins raised together versus twins raised apart, like a parent trap situation where we have identical twins, but one was raised in another country. Did you guys see the Lindsay Lohan version of the Parent Trap, like when she was still cute before she went crazy? It's a pretty good movie. So, you know, if you want an excuse to watch a movie, you can watch the Lindsay Lohan Parent Trap and say that it's for this class, and your parents will never know. Okay, so how do we do the twin studies with personality? So like I said, what we do is we basically assess the personality of each sibling or twin, and then we do correlations to see how similar are they. So the idea is that if we find higher correlations in identical twins compared to fraternal twins who had the same environment with different genetics, then that argues for a genetic component to personality because the correlations are higher. Now, twin studies are sometimes criticized because there are other similarities that identical twins have compared to fraternal twins. Like, for example, sometimes they'll have similar names like Rod and Todd or something like that. They might even have parents who dress them exactly the same. So the idea is that if there are high correlations between identical twins, it might be because of biology. It might be because they have a more similar environment than any other set of siblings. So that's one criticism of twin studies. That said, there are a bunch of studies showing that the correlation for identical twins or monozygotic on this slide, the MZ column, is higher than any other combination of siblings. So for this particular chart, you can see that we have monozygotic in that middle column compared to dizygotic or fraternal twins in the last column. You can see that the correlations are basically almost double for most of the big 5 personality traits. So again, this argues that there might be a biological driver for personality traits because we see the highest correlation, the highest similarity in identical twins who share genetics. So you could use this table to argue for a strong biological driver of personality traits like the Big Five. That said, I also want to point out that some people use this exact same table, this exact same study, to argue that there are other factors that are not biological in terms of personality, because even if you look at identical twins raised in the same setting, the correlation of one twin to the other is still right around 0.4 or 0.5. So where is the rest of the correlation, right? The correlation could theoretically go all the way up to 1.00. So we're only explaining maybe half of personality if you think about it in that way. So there are clearly other non-biological drivers of personality as well that we can see from this exact same study. Okay, the last major topic that I want to cover from the biological perspective of personality is, does the brain actually tell us about personality? And remember that we started this research with Phineas Gage, and we thought that personality was sort of driven by the frontal lobe. And there is evidence of that. But the first thing I want to do is talk to you about this left brain versus right brain idea. I learned this growing up in like elementary school and high school, that left-brained people basically are good at like math and logic and science, and right-brained people are more artistic and creative. And this is still something that is sort of perpetuated by society today, and there are actually books supposedly giving research on this. I'm going to tell you right now that when research is done by valid, reliable psychological people with like control groups and true experiments, we do not find any evidence of this left brain versus right brain, science versus art distinction. So I'm telling you right now, from a scientific perspective, this whole left brain, right brain, science versus art distinction is total bullshit, okay? I'm gonna use the word bullshit, I'm swearing, because I feel strongly it's totally not true. There is no scientific evidence for this. So please don't like get caught up in the trap of somebody saying like, oh, you're really a left-brained person. Just tell them my professor said that that's bullshit, because it is. Okay, that said, there is some scientific research showing that there are differences in brain anatomy and how we seem to respond to the world. Okay, not science versus art. That's not correct. The way that we do the research that does seem to show some differences is through what we call EEGs. So EEGs basically have you strap this like skull cap to your head, and they have these little electrodes that measure the electrical activity of that little part of your brain, basically. Okay, so I actually had an EEG done my freshman year of college because I have epilepsy. And so the idea is that epilepsy is caused by basically like too much electricity in your brain, and that's why you have muscular seizures. I think it's because I'm developing superpowers, so I don't really mind it. Have yet to discover what exactly those superpowers are, but I'm sure that they're going to come out soon. So the EEG has, each little electrode is tied to basically a computer graph that's going to show you like each of these little lines here is tied to one of the electrodes. So you can see like, okay, this person seems to be having a lot of activity in this part of the brain right here because the waves are bigger, basically. Okay, so when we use EEGs in personality research, we do find an interesting result, and that is called cerebral asymmetry. So the idea is that some people have about equal electricity in the two halves of their brain, their two hemispheres of their brain. Most people, it's about equal. For some people, they have more electrical activity in their left brain versus their right brain. It's not about math versus science. It's actually about your emotional experiences. And this can be detected in people of any age, including even in infants. So what are the different emotional experiences? What we find is that if you have more activity in the left half of your brain, this is my left. I know that for you it looks like it's the right side of the screen, but it's my left. For people who have more activity in the left half of their brain, they tend to be generally people who are in more positive moods. So they tend to be happier, they laugh more, they smile more. They just tend to be kind of like more optimistic in their outlook in life. And people who have more activity in the right half of their brain are more depressed and anxious. So we see this again in all ages. One example study for infants was they hooked little baby EEGs up to 10-month-old infants, and they found that for the babies that had more activity in the left half of their brain, they smiled more, showing again that positive mood. And for babies who had more activity in the right half of their brain, they cried more, again showing more of that negative mood. In adults, we see this pattern in a variety of studies. I've just put 3 examples here on the slide. But basically, again, more activity on the right half of the brain is tied to people who experience more anxiety and depression. So that does seem to be a biological factor in this kind of general personality of your sort of mood, right? Which does seem to be consistent over time and situation, which is our definition of personality. An example of how we have explored this in a more experimental setting, as opposed to just kind of measuring it, is Davidson brought people into the lab and found that people who have more activity in the left half of their brain were more responsive to positive mood films. So if they watched comedies, they started sort of from a neutral level of happiness, and they went up more. They got happier more than people who have activity in the right half of their brain. Conversely, people who have more activity in the right half of their brain, when they started neutrally and then they watched something like a horror movie, they actually got more depressed and anxious compared to people who have activity in the left half of their brain. So the left people basically have kind of a tendency for environmental stimuli to make them happier, whereas people with the right half activity have the tendency for environmental stimuli to kind of bring them down. So again, this is a really interesting biological driver of how we respond to our environment and what kinds of emotions we experience. And you might not realize that that neural activity is actually one of the causes for how we respond to things in our world. The last slide for the biological perspective is just a final note, kind of critical analysis of this perspective. So we've gone through a lot of research indicating biological influences of our personality, but a lot of people don't particularly want to make that conclusion from these studies because they're uncomfortable with the idea that you have no control over your personality, that your biology is basically your destiny in terms of personality. There are lots and lots of studies that can be used to argue that our personality can change, that we can have more control over our personality, or even that our personality is a little bit more malleable than studies like temperament studies would indicate, because we might get depressed due to things like a trauma in our life. We might be happier if we get that promotion or something like that. Even the same studies can be used to argue in favor of biology or against biology, like the twin studies that I was mentioning earlier. So this is a fairly controversial perspective when we're trying to understand how personality works. And I'll be interested to see what your thoughts are in your essays from this personality perspective. Let me know if you have any questions.